Rockford, Illinois, October 15th, 2004. The coffee was still warm when Margaret Chen's co-workers realized something was wrong. Her desk at Midwest Insurance Solutions remained untouched since the previous evening, the October wind rattling the windows of the three-story building on North Main Street. Margaret never missed work without calling. In 12 years at the company, she had built a reputation as the most reliable claims adjuster in the office, always the first to arrive and often the last to leave. Her supervisor, Janet Williams, stood by Margaret's cubicle, studying the neat stack of pending files and the small framed photo of Margaret's daughter, Amy, in her high school graduation cap. The autumn leaves outside painted the parking lot in shades of amber and rust, but inside the fluorescent-lit office, an unsettling quiet had settled over the insurance company. Margaret Chen was 46 years old, a single mother who had moved to Rockford from California in 1995 after her divorce. She lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Elm Street with Amy, now 19, and studying at Northern Illinois University. Neighbors described Margaret as kind but private, someone who kept to herself but always offered a warm smile and helped carry groceries when needed. The morning of October 15th felt different from the start. Margaret's neighbor, Eleanor Patterson, noticed that Margaret's silver Honda Civic wasn't in the driveway when she went to collect her newspaper at 7 a.m. This struck her as odd because Margaret typically left for work at 8:15 a.m. sharp, and Eleanor had become accustomed to the sound of the car door closing as she finished her morning coffee. At work, Margaret's absence became increasingly concerning as the hours passed. She had been handling a particularly complex insurance claim involving a house fire on the south side of town, and the family was expecting her call that morning. When Janet tried Margaret's home phone, it rang endlessly. Her cell phone went straight to voicemail, the recording playing Margaret's calm, professional voice asking callers to leave a detailed message. By noon, Janet made the decision to drive to Margaret's house during her lunch break. The small white house sat quietly on Elm Street, surrounded by maple trees that had begun shedding their leaves. Margaret's car was nowhere to be seen, and the curtains were drawn tight. When Janet knocked on the front door, the hollow sound echoed through what seemed like an empty house. The mailbox was full, letters and bills spilling out onto the front porch. Among them, Janet noticed several pieces of mail from the previous 2 days, suggesting Margaret hadn't been home to collect them. A newspaper lay soggy and forgotten on the front steps, the headlines about the upcoming presidential election now smeared and unreadable. Janet's concern deepened when she walked around to the back of the house. The back door stood slightly ajar, unusual for someone as careful about security as Margaret. Through the gap, she could see into the kitchen, where a coffee mug sat on the counter next to an open newspaper folded to the crossword puzzle. Everything appeared normal, as if Margaret had simply stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. But she didn't return that afternoon or that evening. When Amy called from college that night, worried because her mother hadn't answered her daily check-in call, the reality began to sink in. Margaret Chen had vanished without explanation, leaving behind a life that showed no signs of planning for departure. The Rockford Police Department took the missing person report the following morning, but Detective Michael Rodriguez noted immediately that nothing about the case suggested foul play. Margaret's purse was missing, along with her car keys and cell phone. No signs of struggle were evident in the house, and neighbors reported no unusual sounds or activities. It appeared, for all intents and purposes, that Margaret had simply walked away from her life. But those who knew Margaret Chen understood that this explanation made no sense at all. She was devoted to her daughter, meticulous about her responsibilities, and had been looking forward to Amy's upcoming visit home for Halloween weekend. Margaret had even bought candy for trick-or-treaters and had mentioned to Eleanor her plans to decorate the front porch with autumn flowers. As the October days grew shorter and colder, Margaret's absence created a void that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Her daughter drove home from college, her face pale with worry and confusion. Amy walked through the house she had grown up in, touching familiar objects and searching for any clue that might explain where her mother had gone. But the house held its secrets close, offering no answers to the question that would haunt the Chen family for years to come. What happened to Margaret Chen on that cool October morning in 2004? The first week of Margaret's disappearance brought a flurry of activity that seemed to offer hope. Detective Rodriguez organized search parties that combed through Rock Cut State Park and the forests along the Rock River. Volunteers from Margaret's Church, St. Timothy's Lutheran, joined co-workers and neighbors in walking through wooded areas and checking abandoned buildings throughout Winnebago County. Amy Chen threw herself into the search with desperate energy. She created missing person flyers featuring her mother's smiling face from the previous Christmas, describing Margaret as 5'4", with shoulder-length black hair and brown eyes, last seen wearing a navy blue coat and black work shoes. Amy stapled these flyers to telephone poles throughout Rockford, posted them in grocery stores and coffee shops, and handed them out at the local mall. The local media picked up the story within days. Channel 13 News ran a segment about the missing insurance adjuster, interviewing Amy and showing footage of the search efforts. The story appeared in the Rockford Register-Star with the headline, "Local Woman Vanishes Without Trace." For a brief moment, it seemed like the community's attention might generate the lead that would bring Margaret home. But as October turned to November, the search efforts began to slow. The autumn weather grew harsh, with early snowfall making outdoor searches treacherous. Volunteers who had initially shown up in large numbers gradually returned to their normal routines. The media moved on to other stories, and the missing person flyers that Amy had so carefully posted began to fade and tear in the wind and rain. Detective Rodriguez continued his investigation, but the leads were frustratingly sparse. Margaret's bank account showed no activity after October 14th. Her credit cards remained unused. Her cell phone had been turned off or destroyed, making it impossible to track. The Honda Civic seemed to have disappeared as completely as Margaret herself, despite an APB that extended throughout Illinois and into neighboring states. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was Margaret's behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Co-workers reported that she had seemed distracted and slightly anxious the week before she vanished. She had made several personal phone calls during work hours, which was unusual for her. When asked about these calls, Margaret had been vague, mentioning something about family matters that needed attention. Amy tried to piece together her mother's final days through conversations with anyone who had interacted with Margaret. Eleanor Patterson, the neighbor, remembered that Margaret had seemed troubled when they spoke briefly on October 13th. Margaret had been checking her mailbox more frequently than usual and had asked Eleanor if she had noticed any unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood. When Eleanor asked if everything was all right, Margaret had simply nodded and said she was probably being overly cautious. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Detective Rodriguez discovered that Margaret had withdrawn $2,000 in cash from her savings account on October 12th, 3 days before her disappearance. The bank teller remembered the transaction because Margaret had seemed nervous and had asked several questions about the withdrawal limits. When the teller asked if everything was okay, Margaret had explained that she needed the money for home repairs, but her hands had been shaking as she filled out the withdrawal slip. This discovery led investigators to wonder if Margaret had been planning her disappearance, but Amy adamantly rejected this theory. She pointed out that her mother had made plans for the following weeks, including a dental appointment and a commitment to help with the church's Thanksgiving dinner. Margaret had also been excited about Amy's upcoming graduation from college in the spring and had already begun discussing plans for a celebration dinner. As winter settled over Rockford, the case grew cold in more ways than one. The police department had other cases demanding attention, and without new leads, Margaret's file was moved to the inactive pile. Amy returned to college reluctantly, unable to concentrate on her studies, but knowing that her mother would have insisted she continue her education. The house on Elm Street remained exactly as Margaret had left it. Amy couldn't bring herself to change anything, hoping against hope that her mother might walk through the front door with a reasonable explanation for her absence. The coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, now collecting dust. The crossword puzzle remained half-finished, Margaret's careful handwriting visible in blue ink. Months passed, then years. Amy graduated from college and took a job in Chicago, but she returned to Rockford every few months to check on the house and to visit Detective Rodriguez, hoping for news that never came. The detective, now promoted to sergeant, always received Amy with kindness, but had little to offer beyond reassurance that the case remained open and that any new information would be thoroughly investigated. The community's memory of Margaret Chen began to fade. New families moved into the neighborhood, and Eleanor Patterson eventually stopped mentioning the woman who had vanished from the house next door. The insurance company hired a replacement for Margaret, and her desk was cleared out and reassigned. Life moved forward, as it always does, leaving Margaret's disappearance as a painful question mark in the lives of those who had loved her. But some mysteries have a way of preserving themselves, waiting in silence for the right moment to reveal their secrets. And in a house that had been carefully maintained but rarely occupied, Margaret Chen's story was far from over. Rockford, Illinois, September 2019. 15 years had passed when Amy Chen Morrison decided it was finally time to sell her mother's house. Now 34, married, and living in Denver with her 2 young children, Amy could no longer justify keeping the property that had become more of a burden than a connection to her past. The decision hadn't been easy, but the monthly maintenance costs and property taxes had become impractical for a house that sat empty for most of the year. Real estate agent Linda Torres suggested that Amy consider updating the basement before listing the property. The finished basement, which Margaret had used as a home office and storage area, needed cleaning and possibly some renovation to appeal to modern buyers. Amy had avoided spending much time in the basement over the years, finding it too painful to sort through her mother's belongings. But she knew Linda was right about improving the property's marketability. On a warm September afternoon, Amy arrived at the house with her husband, David, and their moving supplies. The basement felt musty and forgotten, filled with boxes that Amy had never fully explored. Margaret had been a meticulous organizer, and each box was carefully labeled with contents and dates. There were boxes of Amy's school projects, holiday decorations, old photographs, and business documents from Margaret's years at the insurance company. David was helping Amy move a heavy filing cabinet when they noticed something unusual. The cabinet had been positioned against the far wall of the basement for as long as Amy could remember, but when they shifted it to clean behind it, they discovered that it had been concealing a small area where the wall seemed different from the rest of the basement. Upon closer inspection, they realized that a section of the drywall had been carefully cut and replaced. The seams were nearly invisible, painted over with the same beige color as the rest of the wall. But once they noticed the slight differences in texture and color, the rectangular outline became unmistakable. Someone had created a hidden compartment behind the filing cabinet, and from the precision of the work, it was clear that this had been done deliberately and carefully. Amy's heart began racing as David used a utility knife to carefully score along the seams. The drywall section came away easily, revealing a shallow cavity that had been created between the wall studs. Inside the hidden space, wrapped in plastic bags to protect against moisture, were several items that made Amy's breath catch in her throat. The first item was her mother's missing purse, the black leather handbag that Margaret had carried every day to work. Inside the purse, Amy found Margaret's wallet, still containing her driver's license, credit cards, and $47 in cash. Margaret's reading glasses were folded neatly in their case, along with the small address book she had always carried and a tube of the rose-colored lipstick she favored. But it was the second item that truly shocked Amy, a leather-bound journal that she had never seen before. The journal was thick, with a brass clasp that had tarnished slightly over the years. When Amy opened it with trembling hands, she saw page after page of her mother's careful handwriting, documenting events and conversations that painted a picture of the months leading up to Margaret's disappearance that Amy had never imagined. The journal entries began in August 2004, just 2 months before Margaret vanished. The early entries described Margaret's growing concern about someone who had been asking questions about her past. Margaret wrote about receiving phone calls where the caller would hang up when she answered, and about noticing the same dark sedan parked on Elm Street on multiple occasions. As Amy read further, a chilling story emerged. Margaret had written about being approached by a man named Richard Kowalski, who claimed to be investigating an insurance fraud case from the 1990s in California. According to the Journal, Kowalski had contacted Margaret at work, saying he needed to discuss her role in processing claims related to a warehouse fire that had occurred in Los Angeles in 1994. Margaret's journal entries revealed her growing alarm as she realized that Kowalski wasn't who he claimed to be. She had begun her own investigation, calling former colleagues in California and discovering that the warehouse fire case had never been officially investigated as fraud. No legitimate investigator named Richard Kowalski existed at any of the agencies he claimed to represent. The most disturbing entries came from early October 2004. Margaret wrote about discovering that someone had been in her house while she was at work. Small things had been moved, papers had been shuffled, and she had found mud tracks on the basement stairs that she was certain she hadn't made. She had changed the locks and installed a security system, but her journal revealed a growing sense that she was being watched and followed. Amy continued reading with growing horror as her mother's words described meetings with Kowalski that became increasingly threatening. He had demanded information about specific insurance claims and had suggested that Margaret had been involved in some form of fraud or cover-up. When Margaret insisted she had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, Kowalski had become aggressive, threatening to make things difficult for her and Amy if she didn't cooperate. The final journal entry was dated October 14, 2004, the day before Margaret disappeared. In shaky handwriting that revealed her emotional state, Margaret had written about receiving a final phone call from Kowalski. He had given her an ultimatum: meet him at a location outside of town, or face consequences that would destroy both her reputation and Amy's future. Margaret's last written words were heart-wrenching. "I won't let him hurt Amy. I have to end this, whatever it takes." If something happens to me, I pray that someday Amy will understand that everything I did was to protect her. As Amy sat in the basement, surrounded by the boxes of her childhood memories, holding her mother's journal and purse, the true scope of Margaret's final months began to crystallize. Her mother hadn't disappeared willingly, and she certainly hadn't abandoned her daughter. Margaret Chen had been systematically terrorized by someone who had wanted something from her past, and she had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the daughter she loved more than her own life. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. Who was Richard Kowalski, and what did he really want? What connection did Margaret have to the warehouse fire in Los Angeles? And most importantly, what had happened to Margaret after she wrote that final, desperate entry? The answers to these questions lay hidden in the past, waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to pursue the truth that Margaret Chen had died trying to protect. Amy's discovery of the journal changed everything. Within hours of finding the hidden compartment, she had contacted the Rockford Police Department and spoken with Detective Sarah Martinez, who had taken over cold cases when Detective Rodriguez retired in 2015. Martinez immediately recognized the significance of the new evidence and reopened Margaret Chen's case with renewed urgency. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the Rockford police had undertaken in years. Using the information from Margaret's journal, Detective Martinez began tracing the identity of Richard Kowalski and his connection to the 1994 warehouse fire in Los Angeles. What she discovered through cooperation with California authorities was a web of corruption and fraud that stretched back decades. The warehouse fire in Los Angeles had indeed been the subject of a massive insurance fraud investigation, but not in the way that Kowalski had claimed. The fire had been deliberately set by the warehouse owner, Thomas Brennan, as part of an elaborate scheme to collect insurance money on a failing business. Brennan had enlisted the help of several accomplices, including a man named Robert Kowalski, Richard's younger brother. The fraud scheme had been successful initially, with the insurance company paying out nearly $2.3 million in claims. Margaret Chen, working as a claims adjuster in Los Angeles at the time, had processed the paperwork efficiently and without suspicion. The fraud had only been discovered 2 years later during a routine audit, by which time Brennan and the Kowalski brothers had disappeared with the money. Robert Kowalski had been arrested in 1998 and had died in prison in 2002 while serving a 10-year sentence for insurance fraud and arson. His brother Richard had managed to evade capture, but the statute of limitations for prosecution had run out by 2004. However, Richard Kowalski had become obsessed with the idea that there had been additional money hidden from the original fraud scheme, money that he believed Margaret Chen had helped to conceal. Detective Martinez's investigation revealed that Kowalski had spent years tracking down everyone involved in the original case, convinced that there was a secret cache of money that had never been found. His focus on Margaret stemmed from his brother's prison letters, in which Robert had mentioned that the lady in the insurance office knew more than she let on. This was likely Robert's paranoid delusion, but Richard had latched onto it as his last hope for recovering what he saw as his inheritance. The breakthrough in the case came when Martinez discovered that Richard Kowalski had been arrested in Nevada in 2006 for attempting to extort money from another former insurance employee. During that arrest, Kowalski had been found in possession of several items that belonged to Margaret Chen, including her car keys and cell phone. He had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for extortion and had died of a heart attack in 2012 while still incarcerated. With Kowalski dead, the direct investigation into Margaret's disappearance seemed to hit another dead end. But Martinez persisted, and her efforts were rewarded when she discovered that Kowalski had been arrested with a storage unit key that had never been fully investigated by Nevada authorities. The storage unit, located outside Las Vegas, had been paid for through an automatic bank withdrawal that had continued for years after Kowalski's death. When Martinez arranged for the storage unit to be opened in October 2019, what they found inside provided the final heartbreaking answers to Margaret Chen's disappearance. Among Kowalski's belongings, investigators discovered a detailed map of the Rock River area near Rockford, with specific locations marked along the riverbank. They also found Margaret's Honda Civic registration and a handwritten note in Kowalski's handwriting that described a meeting location along the river. The most damning evidence was a tape recorder containing a recording that Kowalski had apparently made during his final confrontation with Margaret. The recording was difficult to listen to, but it provided crucial evidence of what had happened on October 15, 2004. On the tape, Margaret's voice could be heard pleading with Kowalski, insisting that she had no knowledge of any hidden money and begging him to leave her and her daughter alone. The recording captured the final moments of Margaret Chen's life, as Kowalski became increasingly angry and violent when Margaret couldn't provide the information he demanded. The tape ended abruptly, but investigators were able to use the background sounds and Kowalski's own voice describing their location to pinpoint where the confrontation had taken place. Armed with this information, search teams returned to the Rock River area in November 2019. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they focused their efforts on the remote area that Kowalski had marked on his map. After 3 days of searching, they discovered the remains of Margaret Chen buried beneath years of river sediment and fallen leaves, along with her car keys and the $2,000 she had withdrawn from her bank account. The medical examiner's report confirmed what the recording had suggested. Margaret had died from blunt force trauma, likely during a struggle with Kowalski when she had tried to escape from their meeting. The evidence suggested that she had fought bravely to defend herself, but Kowalski's size and rage had overpowered her efforts. Amy Chen Morrison finally had the answers she had sought for 15 years, but the truth brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief. Her mother had indeed died protecting her, sacrificing her own life rather than allowing Kowalski to target Amy in his desperate search for money that had never existed. Margaret's journal entries revealed a woman who had faced her final weeks with courage and determination, doing everything in her power to shield her daughter from a dangerous man's delusions. The case officially closed in December 2019, with Margaret Chen's death ruled a homicide committed by Richard Kowalski, who had died in prison 7 years earlier. While justice in the traditional sense could never be served, the truth had finally emerged from the silence that had surrounded Margaret's disappearance for so long. Amy arranged for her mother's remains to be buried in a peaceful cemetery outside Rockford, with a headstone that read, "Margaret Chen, beloved mother and protector, 1958-2004. At the funeral service, attended by former co-workers, neighbors, and church members who still remembered Margaret after all those years, Amy spoke about her mother's courage and the love that had motivated her final sacrifice. The house on Elm Street was eventually sold, but not before Amy had taken one final walk through the rooms where she had grown up, with a mother who had loved her enough to die protecting her. The basement where Margaret had hidden her journal and purse was cleaned and repainted, erasing the physical evidence of the secret that had waited 15 years to be discovered. But Margaret Chen's story lived on, a testament to a mother's love and the lengths to which people will go to protect those they cherish most. In a world where some mysteries remain forever unsolved, Margaret's case stood as proof that the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing when the time is right. And sometimes that truth reveals not just what happened, but the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing impossible choices. The journal that had revealed the truth was preserved by Amy as a reminder of her mother's strength and love. Its pages contained not just the story of Margaret's final weeks, but a record of a woman who had faced terror with dignity and had chosen love over fear, even in her darkest hour. It was a legacy that would live on in Amy's memory and in the hearts of all who learned Margaret Chen's story, a story of love, sacrifice, and the enduring power of a mother's devotion.